The hidden cost of treating nations as equal borrowers. On paper, Europe's governments looked the same. Shared rules, shared currency, shared discipline. Markets priced them as if differences no longer mattered. That assumption reshaped everything. To understand why it still matters today, we need to revisit a quiet decision. Because treating nations as equal borrowers did more than lower costs. It rewired incentives across Europe's entire financial system. When monetary integration deepened, risk was redefined. Currency risk disappeared. Interest rates converged. Borrowing costs compressed across borders. For governments, this was transformative. Debt became cheaper. Financing horizons lengthened. Markets rewarded membership with confidence. For banks, it changed behavior immediately. Sovereign debt across Europe appeared interchangeable. Yield differences shrank. Capital treatment reinforced the perception of uniform safety. This created momentum. Banks expanded holdings beyond national borders. Portfolios diversified on paper. Exposure looked balanced, modern, sophisticated. But this balance rested on a fragile assumption. That credit risk had been neutralized by structure. That membership implied discipline. That divergence was a thing of the past. Markets stopped asking old questions. Debt levels mattered less. Fiscal capacity faded into the background. What mattered was alignment, not fundamentals. This shift felt rational. Shared institutions promised oversight. Common rules promised restraint. The system appeared designed to prevent imbalance. Yet, by smoothing differences, Europe also muted signals. Warnings softened. Pressure arrived later than it should have. Risk did not vanish. It waited. And when reality finally tested the idea of equal borrowers, the cost of that assumption became impossible to ignore. As markets embraced uniformity, incentives adjusted quietly. Governments faced weaker discipline. Borrowing felt easier. The cost of delay seemed low. Banks responded to signals. They treated sovereign debt as scalable. Returns were predictable. Risk weighting remained favorable. This encouraged accumulation. Exposure grew gradually, not through excess, but through normalization. Rating distinctions blurred. Yield spreads narrowed. Warnings were absorbed without reaction. Stability appeared self-sustaining. But equal pricing hid unequal capacity. Economic structures differed. Growth prospects diverged. Fiscal flexibility varied widely. These differences mattered. Even when markets ignored them, debt dynamics remained national. Adjustment costs were uneven. Shock absorption depended on local strength. When conditions shifted, repricing began. Not smoothly, abruptly. Markets rediscovered discrimination. Spreads widened sharply. Liquidity fractured. Assumptions unraveled. Banks holding cross-border sovereign debt felt the impact. Valuations dropped. Capital positions strained. What had looked diversified behaved like concentration. Governments reacted under pressure. Budgets tightened. Policy space shrank. Credibility became a daily concern. The system faced a dilemma. Treat divergence openly and risk fragmentation. Suppress it and risk credibility. Responses balanced between the two. Support mechanisms emerged. Conditional assistance followed. Stability was preserved, but at a cost. The belief in equal borrowing had delivered calm. Its collapse delivered stress. And the transition was far from smooth. The conflict intensified as divergence became undeniable. Markets no longer debated theory. They priced reality. Borrowing costs separated rapidly. Access depended on credibility, not membership. Uniform assumptions fractured under pressure. Banks were caught in between. Assets once treated as interchangeable now carried distinct risk profiles. Capital buffers thinned. Funding conditions tightened. This forced difficult choices. Reduce exposure and crystallize losses. Hold positions and absorb volatility. Every option carried consequences. Governments faced parallel pressure. Fiscal adjustment became urgent. Political constraints tightened. Economic stress fed social tension. Support mechanisms attempted to bridge the gap. They stabilized markets. They bought time. But they also introduced conditions. Assistance came with oversight. Policy autonomy narrowed. Confidence depended on compliance. This altered the relationship between states. Solidarity became conditional. Coordination required negotiation. Trust was no longer automatic. The banking system adapted cautiously. Risk assessments became more granular. Exposure limits returned. Uniformity gave way to selective differentiation, but the damage was done. The illusion of equality had delayed adjustment. Repricing arrived suddenly and forcefully. Shock absorption became harder, not easier. What emerged was a system learning under stress. Differences mattered again. Stability carried a visible cost. Authorities responded with calibration. Buffers were allowed to decline. Countercyclical tools were activated. Temporary relief became necessary. This kept the system functioning, but it also exposed the limits of rules. Frameworks could not anticipate every shock. Judgment could not be removed entirely. The belief that regulation alone could ensure resilience began to fade. Experience replaced theory. Adaptation replaced assumption. The system survived, but its relationship with rules changed forever. What the regulatory crisis revealed was something that technical frameworks are not designed to capture. Rules are built on models. Models are built on history. History records what happened. It does not record what almost happened but didn't, or what would happen under conditions that have not yet occurred. The gap between those three categories is where regulatory fragility lives. European banking regulation had become highly sophisticated in its historical dimension. It captured the lessons of past crises with precision. It codified the right responses to familiar scenarios. It required institutions to hold capital against risks that had materialized before, but it could not fully account for the behavior of many institutions following the same rules simultaneously, because that behavior had not produced a major systemic stress before. The synchronization that the rules created was a new risk, an emergent property of the regulatory system itself, not the intention, the outcome. And emergent properties are, by definition, not captured in the historical data that regulation is built on. When every institution simultaneously reduces a category of exposure because the rules make that category expensive, the prices of that exposure category fall. Falling prices make balance sheets that hold the exposure look weaker. Weaker balance sheets prompt further reduction. Further reduction produces further price falls. The feedback loop is not a failure of individual risk management. It is a failure of collective behavior, shaped by uniform incentives. The rules produce the incentives. The incentives produce the behavior. The behavior produced the systemic stress. And the systemic stress was the thing the rules were designed to prevent. This is not an argument against regulation. It is an argument for humility about what regulation can guarantee. No framework can fully anticipate the system-level consequences of its own rules, because those consequences emerge from how many institutions interact with the framework simultaneously, and that interaction cannot be predicted from any individual institution's perspective or from any regulatory body's historical data. It can only be observed over time as it unfolds, which means regulation must always be supplemented by the willingness to observe, adapt, and accept uncertainty, not as a failure of rigor, but as an honest acknowledgement of the limits of any system built on the past that must function in an always uncertain future. Europe's banking system learned this more slowly than the crisis demanded, and more deeply than any subsequent calm makes visible. The relationship between rules and resilience is never as simple as more of one produces more of the other. Sometimes more rules produce more synchronization, and more synchronization, under stress, produces the very fragility that more rules were meant to prevent. That is not irony. That is the nature of complex systems. And understanding it is more important than any specific rule that follows from it. That understanding is not comfortable. It does not produce clean recommendations. It does not generate press releases or regulatory announcements. It produces only a kind of careful attention, a willingness to watch the system as it is actually behaving, not just as the models predict it will behave, and to adjust before the gap between the two becomes wide enough to matter all at once. That kind of attention is harder to institutionalize than any rule, but it is what the experience ultimately demanded, and what the most effective regulators in the years that followed quietly developed, not as a methodology, as a disposition toward the system they were responsible for and toward the limits of their own ability to fully understand it. The hidden